Yep, and you got your sharp focus and everything.
Mm-hmm. Golden.
Sweet. You rolling?
All right, good. All right. Okay, so good morning. Thanks for joining me for the interview this morning. So we're going to just talk about some about your career and also your own history and how you got interested in economics and how it was that you came to be involved with IRPI. So why don't we start at the beginning, and why don't you just tell me a little bit about where you were born, your upbringing, and those sorts of things.
Well, I was born in a place called Shanks Village outside of New York City. My father was staying there while going to Columbia Law School in 1949. It's basically post-war GI, back to school education. While he was at Columbia, he did actually run across Paul Sweezy, had a couple of teas with him apparently. Took a course from Fritz Machlup, which he thought was the most absurd course in economics anyone could ever possibly take, and he decided not to take anymore. Prior to that, as an undergraduate, he was at Hamilton College. There was an economist there called Gams, John Gams, who's written a textbook against supply and demand, I believe, but also helped form the Association for Evolutionary Economics. So that was his kind of background. He became a labor lawyer, worked for the National Labor Relations Board in Washington, D.C. My mother was a social worker, became involved in civil rights movement, 50s and 60s. So the family was fairly progressive, to the left, in spite of my grandparents' probably chagrin. They did actually buy him for a Christmas present, State and Revolution by Lenin. And so I come from an unusual background in that way. At least what's relevant for economics is that I knew by the time I got involved with economics that there was something different. Not that I knew a great deal about what was meant by different. Not that I knew anything about Marx, even though I read Volume 1 probably a couple of times. Various shorter pieces of Marx, because we had all these collected works in the house. But I knew there was something different. My father also had Pierre Schaffer, Joan Robinson, and Maurice Dobb on his bookshelf. So the issue of something different, but not really knowing anything. Basically, not stupid, but ignorant when at least eyes are open. It's the best that one can claim, at least I can claim for myself, somewhere up into my early 20s, or early 1970s. The Vietnam War, social rights, civil rights, not so much feminist or gay movements, mostly outside my things which I would have recognized at the time, growing up in an upper middle class neighborhood environment outside of Washington, D.C. But I knew of these things, and over time, if you became aware, I should say, you realize that you heard enough rhetoric to realize that people are making connection between the kind of economic system you're in and these particular kinds of events, even though you had no real clue about the nature of the arguments that would connect them. but you're only 19, 20, 21, and coming from a fairly privileged background. The more transformational process occurs, say it, after my second year at university, some reason which I can't remember, my interest in reading and intellectual inquiry took off at a rate which was 3, 5, 6 times more than the previous years. I should say, similar to what it was like before I became involved in sports in high school, things like that, which before I became a teenager with testosterone and all this crap. And so I became more aware. And I also at the same time became aware in philosophy. I mean, 20-year-old, 21-year-old philosophy, at least the early philosophers from Plato, Aristotle, onward up until about 19th century, asked interesting questions, and whether you liked them or not, and had interesting answers. And these answers were directed at society. The mid-19th century, it becomes much more analytically oriented, and the kind of questions they were interested in no longer seemed to be interesting. Marx, I would argue, felt the same way, and economics is what fills the void. And that's what it did for me. Because I have a historical background, undergraduate degree in history, I actually approach economics as an historical subject. So for me, when you start having to read the stuff that comes from Jevons or Roll Ross, something has changed as relevant to Smith, Ricardo, or Marx. And of course, given the other social background, civil rights and Vietnam War, whatever, this reinforces this coincidental change in reading with regard to philosophy and economics. So that's what pushes me into economics. Mind, I don't have any economics, but that's what pushes me into going into economics.
You're a history major as an undergraduate, correct?
Yes, I was. I've always wanted to be in history. At least for Americans, in their high school yearbook for seniors, they often ask, what do you want to be when you graduate, grow up, whatever? And I put down history professor.
Really? In your high school yearbook?
Yes.
Wow.
I had always been interested in teaching, and teaching at university, more so. But you have to remember, I have one grandfather with a PhD in political science, a second grandfather with a law degree, a third father with a law degree, and a mother with a master's of social work.
Wow.
Come from upper middle class educated elite.
Yeah, I've seen your bookshelf at your home, and some of those books have been there for generations, very scholarly books that you mentioned were from your grandfather and from other people in your family.
Yes, that's my background.
That's interesting. So how did you begin to study economics? How did you move away from history and wanted to be a history professor and becoming interested in economics? You mentioned philosophy. Did you study philosophy as a student as well?
Yes, I have a history undergraduate degree. Then I have I have more than enough undergraduate philosophy degree courses to have a minor, but never had one. I took these even after I graduated. Basically, philosophy wasn't answering the questions, although some philosophy of science, Kuhn, Lakatos were interesting stuff. History was damn too easy. Didn't answer any analytical questions anybody in their right mind would want to answer. Why anybody would want to study that? Economics is that combination of analytical examination of historical outcomes of how the damn world works. And where else would you want to go if you wanted to explain this stuff? And that's, I think, you just bring that kind of stuff together. That's what drove me in economics. Now the question is, why heterodox, broadly speaking, non-mainstream versus mainstream? It's because I have a background saying that there's alternatives. So therefore, I was never subsumed by the mainstream as truth. Not that I actually knew why it was wrong or why the other stuff had more credence, but I was never indoctrinated so I could come in and ask questions, or better yet, I can ask my father.
So let's talk a little bit more then about your economics training, because your formal training, it sounds like you had already read and been exposed to some of this material through your parents, and particularly through your father and his in his library. And so you then went on to Rutgers for your doctoral degree.
Well, no, let's get a step back before that.
Okay.
This would be 1973. Let's just say that. I started reading economics. I have kept a record of everything I've read from 1972 thereabouts to the present day. And I can tell you, you can see the transition to reading economics. So I wanted to read economics. So I get married. My wife and I moved to New York City. And by that time, I wanted to do economics. Don't tell me precisely when. So in the spring semester of '74, I take Capital Volume 1 class at New School and a class on theories of the business cycle by a guy named Kyler.
Who taught the Marx class?
There was a young gentleman from Yale that got killed in a car crash, Levine, and he got replaced by Mr. Roosevelt.
I see. This is
Heimer.
Stephen Heimer.
Stephen Heimer got killed in
Yeah.
an automobile crash, and Mr. Roosevelt stepped in to replace him.
Oh, interesting.
Didn't say that we got along that well. I was an opinionated idiot, but that's a
Frank Roosevelt?
no
Is it?
me.
Oh.
I was an opiniated idiot.
Okay. So you were causing trouble in the Marx class from the beginning?
Yeah,
Okay.
because I was totally ignorant.
Okay.
But that's another issue.
Don't tell me you were raising issues with the labor theory of value even in Volume 1 class.
Indirectly. But like I said, this was based on total stupidity. I apologized to Mr. Roosevelt later on.
Okay.
But I still want to do economics. And not that I want to do mainstream. Not that I actually knew what it was, but that's took a stat class, then went to Saudi Arabia for 2 years, where I started picking up through correspondence courses, intro micro, intro macro, things like that. And I come back after 2 years to Columbia. Columbia has an adult education program where if you spend $1 and you're over 21 or something like that, you get to take the courses with all those other bright undergraduate kids from Columbia College, which aren't overwhelmingly bright.
Mm-hmm.
Just to let people know, we come up through alternative ways. Then I learned my conventional economics. at least as one as an undergraduate. Had a history of thought class from a guy named, a Russian economist. Starts with a K, I can't remember. Had a class with him. Had a class with John Eatwell on effective demand. He was at Barnard at the time. So I came away with a fairly decent undergraduate education. Not fabulous, but then I started from nothing. And Columbia can't make up for nothing. And then I got accepted to go to the University of Edinburgh. The following year, this would be 76, 77, 78, where they made claims about what they wanted to do, didn't match them. I stayed there a year. I basically learned all the economics I need to do, learned to go to graduate school that year, read everything. So when I went to Rutgers, I was far more prepared than almost anybody to sit into graduate school education, especially from a heterodox perspective. I was by then clearly a heterodox economist, in part because while I was at Columbia, I was told, people got to know that I was this strange undergraduate, and I read all this stuff on pricing because I'm a micro person. And they told me to go down the street and see this strange guy called Alfred Eichner. So I go down the street after reading Alfred Eichner's Megacorp book. I go down the street, walk into his office, and ask him, do you want to talk about how the markup is determined? That obviously resonated very well with a person who made part of his reputation over determination of the profit markup.
And this is at Rutgers, correct?
No, this is at Columbia.
Oh, Eichner was at Columbia, or was he?
No, he was at Columbia. He was at teaching at Purchase.
I see.
He didn't come to Columbia until a year after I was there.
But he was. Oh, so you went up to see him at Purchase, or you saw him in New York?
I saw him in New York.
I see. So then, so you prepared yourself through. So you went some courses at the New School, some courses at Columbia, and then a year in Edinburgh. And Edinburgh was that had you mentioned to me one time that it had an orientation towards industrial economics.
That's what they claimed, never showed up.
Really?
And that's why I left.
Okay.
It was I was also unprepared for the kind of system it was, even though I knew it, even though I thought I knew it. Be as it may, I've never considered that year a waste of time. I spent that year reading articles and books and taking notes. Like I said, when I showed up at Rutgers, I was far, far more prepared than, generally prepared than any student. Only probably drawback was stats, a little bit for econometrics. But since I didn't think that there was randomness in the world, it made it very difficult to take stats in a kind of unbelievable grade, and certainly in the early 70s, where randomness was a requirement. Maybe things are different now, but that'd probably be my only real drawback, and probably some mathematics. But I took my linear algebra independently of all this, so I caught up on the mathematics I needed to.
So let's talk a little bit about Rutgers. So you studied at Rutgers, and by that time Eichner was at Rutgers also?
He came my second year. The people who were there my first year was Nina Shapiro, who was on my dissertation committee, Paul Davidson, Jan Kragel, a guy named Alessandro Mercaglia, who had just finished writing a book. We're getting it translated on Schraff and the Theory of Prices. Probably the first American to read it. And he was the first Italian in the United States to hear me say that I actually read your book. A guy named Sergio Paranella, who was there for a semester. A very strong post-Keynesian connection when I first arrived. Now the visiting people left. I mean, I was nature of the appointment. But Nina Shapiro stayed, had a great deal of importance to me in terms, especially about how to think about economics. She was very good. Alfred came, and then those were the two major points on my committee. There were a couple of others from the program, but
How was your training there? Did you find it useful or?
there was conventional middle PhD program training. Not as good as I would have wanted, but it was certainly in the micro. The micro could have been a little bit better, but it was adequate. I mean, other than going to set theory and whatever, it still covered the same damn stuff. So the theory got taught directly, but never critically. That's the only drawback to it. The macro, I skirted around. Davidson taught the first semester, and that was his take on macro, aggregate supply and demand, etc. Created a lot of general controversy in the department because there's clearly a transformational process into rational expectations and all this new classical stuff, which he didn't bring in. But if you looking for something prior to that, it was fairly accurate and it was fairly good. And if you did a little bit of work in the class, then you knew precisely what was going on. So I basically knew coming out of that class everything that any quote post-Keynesian macro person would know about macroeconomics. This is independent whether you're Davidson, Minsky, or anybody else. It was completely thorough. The second semester was going to be on modern growth theory. My God, one of the most dull topics one could ever think of having to study. But I pulled a fast one and said, could I have my theories of the business cycle substituted, which I took at New School, for the second semester growth theories class? And they said yes. So I skipped out of modern growth theory, which that was a good thing. I skipped out of, you didn't have to take a second semester of econometrics, Bayesian econometrics. Now that was a mistake. I should have actually have taken that. But skipping growth theory, I think, was a good move. But in its place, I took a course, a readings course from Jan Kriegel, and where he had me read, in part, the correspondence between Herod and Kriegel that had just turned up in volumes 13 and 14, and asked me to write about it because it dealt with the Oxford Economist Research Group. I did so as the class project, refined it, submitted it to the Oxford Economics papers that following fall, which got accepted, top 25 publication in a top 25 journal. Time. I don't know of any, like, I could be wrong, but I don't know of any heterodox economist of my age, of my time, who actually did something like that. I was lucky, but the point is that I got tremendous advice from an advisor. I could actually write something and send it to the right kind of journal, who editor would be absolutely interested in such a topic.
So, what was Al Eichner's influence on you, do you think?
Well, aside from somebody doing micro the way I'm doing it, which is almost impossible to find anywhere close to these even today, those who want to do micro and see micro not as simply theory of the business enterprise or something, or theory of price, but something which is like a neoclassical view of microeconomics, have a general framework about how we see the overall economy. Al and I were on the same page, so it's different parts of it, but self-reinforcing and supportive. So that was very good. We had different interests. He was obviously well, I like input-output like that format. He has to come up to appreciate it. He knows other things which I'm not aware of, which I have to come to appreciate. We have these kinds, not issues, but things that we have to deal with. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is something which people don't want to really appreciate, is that if it wasn't for his efforts to promote post-Keynesian heterodox economics,